A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 2, The Illusion of Separation. Introduction. Notes not present in notes. This section is inserted here because it deals with a more fundamental misuse of knowledge, referred to in the Bible as the cause of the fall or separation. There are several introductory remarks which are intended to make these explanations less fear-provoking. The first is a couplet which I drew to your attention during the fragments of Midsummer Night's Dream, which you heard last night. Be as thou wast wont to be. See as thou wast wont to see. It is noteworthy that these words were said by Oberon in releasing Titania from her own errors, both of being and perceiving. These were the words which re-established her true identity as well as her true abilities and judgment. The similarity here is obvious.
There are also some definitions which I asked you to take from the dictionary, which will also be helpful. Their somewhat unusual nature is due to the fact that they are not first definitions in their chronological appearance. Nevertheless, the fact that each of them does appear in the dictionary should be reassuring. Project, verb, to extend forward or out. Project, noun, a plan in the mind. Word, a natural grand division. Note that you originally wrote word instead of world.
We will refer later to projection as related to both mental illness and mental health. It will also be commented on that Lucifer literally projected himself from heaven. We also have observed that man can create an empty shell but cannot create nothing at all.
This emptiness provides the screen for the misuse of projection.
The Garden of Eden, which is described as a literal garden in the Bible, was not the original actual garden at all. It was merely a mental state of complete need-lack. Even in the literal account, it is noteworthy that the pre-separation state was essentially one in which man needed nothing. The tree of knowledge, again an overly literal concept, as is clearly shown by the subsequent reference to eating of the fruit of the tree, is a symbolic reference to some of the misuse of knowledge referred to in the section immediately preceding this one. There is, however, considerable clarification of this concept, which must be understood before the real meaning of the detour into fear can be fully comprehended. Projection, as defined above, this reverse to the verb, is a fundamental attribute of God, which he also gave to his Son. In the creation, God projected his creative ability out of himself toward the souls which he created, and also imbued them with the same loving wish or will to create. We have commented before on the fundamental error involved in confusing what has been created with what is being created. We have also emphasized that man, insofar as the term relates to soul, has not only been fully created, but also have been created perfect. There is no emptiness in him. The next point, too, has already been made, but bears repetition here. The soul, because of its own likeness to its creator, is creative. No child of God is capable of losing this ability because it is inherent in what he is.
Whenever projection in its inappropriate sense is utilized, it always implies that some emptiness or lack of everything must exist, and that it is within man's ability to put his own ideas there instead of the truth. If you will consider carefully that this entails, the following will become quite apparent. First, the assumption is implicit that what God has created can be changed by the mind of man. Second, the concept that what is perfect can be rendered imperfect or wanting is intruded. Third, the belief that man can distort the creations of God, including himself, has arisen and is tolerated. Fourth, that since man can create himself, the direction of his own creation is up to him.
These related distortions represent a picture of what actually occurred in the separation. None of this existed before, nor does it actually exist now. The world, as defined above, was made as a natural grand division or projecting outward of God. That is why everything he created is like him.
It should be noted that the opposite of pro is con. Strictly speaking, then, the opposite of projecting is conjecting, a term which referred to a state of uncertainty or guesswork. Other errors arise in connection with ancillary defenses to be considered later. For example, dejection, which is obviously associated with depression, injection, which can be misinterpreted readily enough in terms of possession fallacies, particularly penetration, and rejection, which is clearly associated with denial. It should be noted also that rejection can be used as refusing, a term which necessarily involves a perception of what is refused as something unworthy.
Projection, as undertaken by God, was very similar to the kind of inner radiance which the children of the Father inherit from him. It is important to note that the term project outward necessarily implies that the real source of projection is internal. This is as true of the Son as of the Father.
The word, in its original connotation, included both the proper creation of man by God and the proper creation by man in his right mind. The latter required the endowment of man by God with free will, because all loving creation is freely given. Nothing in either of these statements implies any sort of level involvement, or in fact, anything except one continuous line of creation in which all aspects are of the same order.
When the lies of the serpent were introduced, they were specifically called lies because they are not true. When man listened, all he heard was untruth. He does not have to continue to believe what is not true unless he chooses to do so. All of his miscreations can disappear in the well-known twinkling of an eye, because it is a visual misperception.
Man's spiritual eye can sleep, but as will shortly appear in the notes, reference Bob, elevator operator, a sleeping eye can still see. One translation of the fall, a view emphasized by Mary Baker Eddy and worthy of note, is that a deep sleep fell upon Adam. While the Bible continues to associate this sleep as a kind of anesthetic utilized for protection of Adam during the creation of Eve, Mrs. Eddy was correct in emphasizing that nowhere is there any reference made to his waking up. While Christian Science is clearly incomplete, this point is much in its favor.
The history of man in the world as he saw it has not been characterized by any genuine or comprehensive reawakening or rebirth. This is impossible as long as man projects the spirit of miscreation. It still remains within him to project as God projected his own spirit to him. In reality, this is the only choice, because his free will was made for his own joy in creating the perfect.
All fear is ultimately reducible to the basic misperception of man's ability to usurp the power of God. It is again emphasized that he neither can nor has been able to do this. In this statement lies the real justification for his escape from fear. This is brought about by his acceptance of the atonement, which places him in a position to realize that his own errors never really occurred.
When the deep sleep fell upon Adam, he was then in a condition to experience nightmares, precisely because he was sleeping. If a light is suddenly turned on while someone is dreaming, and the content of his dream is fearful, he is initially likely to interpret the light itself as part of the content of his own dream. However, as soon as he awakens, the light is correctly perceived as the release from the dream, which is no longer accorded reality. I would like to conclude with the biblical injunction, "Go ye and do likewise." It is not apparent that this depends on the kind of knowledge which was not referred to by the tree of knowledge, which bore lies as fruit. The knowledge that illuminates rather than obscures is the knowledge that which not only makes you free, but also shows you clearly that you are free.
Lead in for page 61 after insert. The preceding sections were inserted because of the necessity of distinguishing between real and false knowledge. Having made this distinction, it is well to return to the errors already listed a while back. It might be well to recapitulate them here. The first involved the fallacy that only the physical is real. The second involved things rather than people. The third involves the endowment of the physical with non-physical properties. And the fourth clarified the misuse of knowledge. All of them were subsumed under possession fallacies. The denial mechanism for 3 has already been set forth in some detail and will also continue after the following.
Retyped. The corresponding denial mechanism for 1 is the sense of physical inability or impotence. The denial mechanism for 2 is often bankruptcy. Collectors of things often drive themselves well beyond their financial means in an attempt to force discontinuance. If this idea of cessation cannot be tolerated, a strange compromise involving both insatiable possessiveness and insatiable throwing away, bankruptcy, may result. An example is the inveterate and compulsive gambler, particularly the horse racing addict. Here the conflicted drive is displaced both from people and things and is invested in animals. The implied derogation of people is the cause of the underlying extreme superstition of the horse racing addict.
The alcoholic is in a similar position, except that his hostility is more inward than outward directed.
Defenses aimed at projecting or retaining error are particularly hard to undo because they introduce second-order misperceptions which obscure the underlying errors still further.
The pseudo-corrective mechanism of 3 is apt to be more varied because of the more inclusive nature of the error, which has already been mentioned. Some of the possibilities are listed below.
One aspect of the possessed conflict can be raised to predominance. If this is attempted in connection with possessing, it leads to the paranoid solution. The underlying component of being possessed is retained in the persecution fantasies, which are generally concomitant.
If being possessed is brought to ascendance, a state of some sort of possession by external force results, but not with a major emphasis on attacking others. Attack by others becomes the more obvious component. In the more virulent forms, there is a sense of being possessed by demons, and unless there is vacillation with a catatonic solution is more likely than a paranoid one.
The focused paranoid has become more rigid in his solution and centers on one source of projection to escape from vacillation. Aside, it should be noted that this type of paranoia is an upside-down form of religion because of its obvious attempt to unify into oneness.
Both 1, 2, and 4 are more likely to produce neurotic rather than psychotic states, though this is by no means guaranteed. However, 3 is inherently more vulnerable to the psychotic correction, again because of the more fundamental level confusion which is involved.
It should be noted, however, that the greater fear which is induced by 3 can itself reach psychotic proportions, thus forcing the individual closer and closer to a psychotic solution.
It is emphasized here that these differences have no effect at all on the miracle, which can heal any of them with equal ease. This is because of the miracle's inherent avoidance of within-error distinctions. Its sole concern is to distinguish between truth on the one hand and all kinds of error on the other. This is why some miracles seem to be of greater magnitude than others. But remember the first point in this course, i.e., that there is no order of difficulty in miracles.
The emphasis on mental illness, which is marked in these notes, reflects the undoing aspect of the miracle. The doing aspect is, of course, much more important, but a true miracle cannot occur on a false basis. Sometimes the undoing must precede it.
At other times, both can occur simultaneously, but you are not up to this at the moment.
Further insights into mental illness can be misused and lead to occupation with one's own symptoms. This is why this area is less constructive for most people than a course primarily devoted to mental health. However, some professions will find some principles of mental illness constructive, especially those which are concerned with mental illness in others. This obviously includes psychologists.
The obvious correction for all types of possession, fallacy, is to redefine possession correctly. In the sense of taking over, the concept does not exist at all in divine reality, which is the only level of reality where real existence is a meaningful term.
One can be taken over unless he wills to be. However, if he places his mind under tyranny rather than authority, he intrudes the submission dominance concept onto free will himself. This produces the obvious contradiction inherent in any formulation that associates free will with imprisonment. Even in the very mild forms, this kind of association is risky and may spread quite unexpectedly, particularly under external stress. This is because it can be internally controlled only if external conditions are peaceful. This is not safe because external conditions are produced by the thoughts of the many, not all of whom are pure in heart as yet.
Why should you be at their mercy? This issue is very closely related to the whole possession issue. You insist on thinking that people can possess you. If you believe that their thoughts or the external environment can affect you, regardless of what they think, you are perfectly unaffected by all expressions of lack of love. These can be either from yourself and others, or from yourself to others, or from others to you. I'm glad you passed that test. It was crucial. This is reference to Helen's reluctance to take dictations as given.
Peace is an attribute in you. You cannot find it outside. All mental illness is some form of external searching. Mental health is inner peace. It enables you to remain unshaken by the lack of love from without and capable through your own miracles of correcting the external conditions which proceed from lack of love in others. A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 2.
The Reinterpretation of Defenses, Notes 230, 579. When you are afraid of anything, you are acknowledging its power to hurt you. Remember that where your heart is, there is your treasure also. This means that you believe in what you value. If you are afraid, you are valuing wrong. Human understanding will inevitably value wrong, and by endowing all human thought with equal power, will inevitably destroy peace. This is why the Bible speaks of the peace of God which passeth human understanding.
This peace is totally incapable of being shaken by human errors of any kind. It denies the ability of anything which is not of God to affect you in any way.
This is the proper use of denial. It is not used to hide anything, but it is used to correct error. It brings all error into the light, and since error and darkness are the same, it abolishes error automatically.
True denial is a very powerful protective device. You can and should deny any belief that error can hurt you. This kind of denial is not a concealment device, but a correction device. The right mind of the mentally healthy depends on it.
You can do anything I ask. I have asked you to perform miracles and have made it very clear that these are natural, corrective, healing, and universal. There is nothing good they cannot do, but they cannot be performed in the spirit of doubt. Remember my own question before you ask yours. O ye of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Reference to Christ and the apostles walking on water.
You have asked yourselves why you cannot really incorporate my words. The idea of cannibalism in connection with the sacrament is a reflection of a distorted view of sharing. I told you before that the word thirst in connection with the Spirit was used in the Bible because of the limited understanding of those to whom I spoke. I also told you not to use it. The same holds for expressions like feeding on. Symbiosis is misunderstood by the mentally ill who use it that way. But I also told you that you must recognize your total dependence on God, a statement which you did not like.
God and the souls he created are symbiotically related. They are completely dependent on each other. The creation of the soul itself has already been perfectly accomplished, but the creation by souls has not. God created souls so he could depend on them because he created them perfectly. He gave them his peace so they would not be shaken and would be unable to be deceived. Whenever you are afraid, you are deceived. Your mind is not serving your soul. This literally starves the soul by denying its daily bread. Remember the poem about the Holy Family which crossed your mind last night, where tricks of words are never said and mercy is as plain as bread. The reason why that had such a strong impact on you originally was because you knew what it meant.
God offers only mercy. Your own words should always reflect only mercy, because that is what you have received and that is what you should give. Justice is a temporary expedient or an attempt to teach men the meaning of mercy. Its judgmental side arises only because man is incapable of injustice, if that is what his mind creates. You are afraid of God's will because you have used your own will, which he created in the likeness of his own, to miscreate.
What you do not realize is that the mind can miscreate only when it is not free. An imprisoned mind is not free by definition. It is possessed or held back by itself. Its will is therefore limited and not free to assert itself.
The three things that crossed your mind, which was comparatively free at the time, are perfectly relevant.
It is all right to remember the past, provided you also remember that anything you suffer is because of your own errors.
In this context, you remark that after the burning, I swore I ever saw him again. I would not, and not was written in later, recognize him. Note, by the way, that you did not put in the not until afterwards. That is because your inherent correction device was working properly at the moment. The result is that you are not denying me.
The story about Hinder, this was an excellent example of misperception, which led to a totally unwarranted fear of a person. Helen's story refers to a very young child who fell down the stairs when Helen had arms open in a welcoming gesture at the bottom of the stairs. For years afterwards, Hinder screamed upon seeing Helen. The misstep which caused her fall had nothing at all to do with you, just as your own missteps have nothing at all to do with me.
Denial of error is a very powerful defense of truth. We have slowly been shifting the emphasis from the negative to the positive use of denial. Remember, we have already stated that denial is not a purely negative device. It results in positive miscreation. That is the way the mentally ill do employ it.
But remember a very early thought of your own. Never underestimate the power of denial. In the service of the right mind, the denial of error frees the mind and reestablishes the freedom of the will. When the will is really free, it cannot miscreate because it recognizes only truth.
Projection arises out of false denial, not out of its proper use. My own role in the Atonement is one of true projection, and that is, I can project to you the affirmation of truth. If you project error to me or to yourself, you are interfering with the process. My use of projection, which can also be yours, is not based on faulty denial, but it does involve the very powerful use of the denial of error.
The miracle worker is one who accepts my kind of denial and projection, unites his own inherent abilities to deny and project with me, and imposes them back on himself and others. This establishes the total lack of threat anywhere. Together, we can then work for the real time of peace, which is eternal.
I inspired Bob, reference to elevator man who took Helen down from her apartment, to make that remark to you. And it is a pity that you heard only the last part, but you can still use that. His remark ended with, "Every shut eye is not asleep." Since your own vision is much improved at the moment, we will go on a while.
Freud's identification of mechanisms was quite correct, as was his recognition of their creative ability. They can indeed create man's perception, both of himself and his surroundings.
But Freud's limitations induced inevitable limits on his own perception. He made two kinds of errors.
The first is that he saw only how the mechanisms worked in the mentally ill.
And the second is his own denial of the mechanism of at-one-ment.
Let us take up the first, because a clear understanding of the second depends on it.
Denial should be directed only to error, and projection should be limited to truth. You should truly give as you have truly received. The golden rule can work effectively only on this basis.
Intellectualization is a poor word, which stems from the brain-mind confusion. Right-mindedness is better. This device defends the right mind and gives it control over the body. Intellectualization implies a split, whereas right-mindedness involves healing.
Withdrawal is properly employed in the service of withdrawing from the desert. It is not a device for escape, but for consolidation. There is only one mind.
Disassociation is quite similar. You should split yourself off from error, but only in defense of integration.
Detachment is essentially a weaker form of dissociation. This is one of the major areas of withholding that both you and Bill are engaging in.
Flight can be undertaken in whatever direction you choose, but note that the concept itself implies flight from something. Flight from error is perfectly appropriate.
Distantiation is a way of putting distance between yourself and what you should fly from.
Regression is a real effort to return to your own original state. In this essence, it is utilized to restore, not to go back to the less mature.
Sublimation should be associated with the sublime.
There are many other so-called dynamic concepts which are profound errors due essentially to the misuse of defenses. Among them is the concept of different levels of aspiration, which results from real level confusion.
However, the main point to be understood from these notes is that you can defend truth as well as error, and in fact, much better.
So far, we have concentrated on ends rather than means, because unless you regard an end as worth achieving, you will not devote yourself to the means by which it can be achieved. Your own question enabled me to shift the emphasis from end to means. Question asked was, how can we incorporate this material? You and Bill have accepted the end as valuable, thus signifying your willingness to use defenses to ensure it.
The means are easier to clarify after the true worth of the goal itself is firmly established.
Everyone defends his own treasure. You do not have to tell him to do this because he will do so automatically. The real question still remains, what do you treasure and how much do you treasure it?
Once you learn to consider these 2 points and bring them into all your actions as the true criteria for behavior, I will have little difficulty in clarifying the means. You have not learned to be consistent about this as yet. I have therefore concentrated on showing you that the means are available whenever you do ask.
You can save a lot of time, however, if you do not need to extend this step unduly. The correct focus will shorten it immeasurably.
Papers will be very easy to read as this time is shortened.
The atonement is the only defense which cannot be used destructively. This is because while everyone must eventually join it, it was not a device which was generated by man. The atonement principle was in effect, long before the atonement itself was begun. The principle was love, and the atonement itself was an act of love. Acts were not necessary before the separation because the time-space belief did not exist.
It was only after the separation that the defense of atonement and the necessary conditions for its fulfillment were planned. It became increasingly apparent that all of the defenses which man can choose to use constructively or destructively were not enough to save him. It was therefore decided that he needed a defense which was so splendid that he could not misuse it, although he could refuse it. His will could not turn it into a weapon of attack, which is the inherent characteristic of all other defenses. The atonement thus becomes the only defense which was not a two-edged sword.
The atonement actually began long before the crucifixion. Many souls offered their efforts on behalf of the separated ones, but they could not withstand the strength of the attack and had to be brought back. Angels came too, but their protection was not enough because the separated ones were not interested in peace. They had already split themselves and were bent on dividing rather than reintegrating. The levels they introduced into themselves turned against each other, and they in turn turned against each other. They established differences, divisions, cleavages, dispersion, and all the other concepts related to the increasing splits they produced.
Not being in their right minds, they turned their defenses from protection to assault and acted literally insanely. It was essential to introduce the split-proof device, which could be used only to heal, if it was used at all.
The atonement was built into the space-time belief in order to set a limit on the need for the belief and ultimately to make learning complete. The atonement is the final lesson. Learning itself, like the classrooms in which it occurs, is temporary. Let all those who overestimate human intelligence remember this. Helen questions last sentence, which she perceives as threatening. The ability to learn has no value when change of understanding is no longer necessary. The eternally creative have nothing to learn. Only after the separation was it necessary to direct the creative force to learning, because changed behavior had become mandatory.
Human beings can learn to improve their behavior and can also learn to become better and better learners. This increase serves Helen notes that this was written served, to bring them in closer and closer accord with the sonship. But the sonship itself is a perfect creation, and the perfection is not a matter of degree. Only while there are different degrees is learning meaningful. The evolution of man is merely a process by which he proceeds from one degree to the next. He corrects his previous missteps by stepping forward. It represents a process which is actually incomprehensible in temporal terms, because he returns as he progresses, or originally goes forward rather than progresses.
The atonement is the device by which he can free himself from the past as he goes ahead. It undoes his past errors, thus making it unnecessary for him to keep retracing his steps without advancing towards his return.
A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Chapter 2, The Illusion of Separation, Section 2b, The Reinterpretation of Defenses. Part 2.
In this sense, the atonement saves time, but like the miracle which serves it, does not abolish it. As long as there is need for atonement, there is need for time. But the atonement, as a completed plan, does have a unique relationship to time. Until the atonement is finished, its various phases will proceed in time, but the whole atonement stands at its end. At this point, the bridge of the return has been built.
Note to Helen, the reason this is upsetting to you is because the atonement is a total commitment. You still think this is associated with loss, that this is the same mistake all the separated ones make, in one way or another. They cannot believe that a defense which cannot attack also is the best defense. Except for this misperception, the angels could have helped them. What do you think the meek shall inherit the earth means? They will literally take it over because of their strength. A two-way defense is inherently weak, precisely because it has two edges. It can turn against the self very unexpectedly. This tendency cannot be controlled except by miracles.
The miracle turns the defense of atonement to the protection of the inner self, which, as it becomes more and more secure, assumes its natural talent of protecting others. The inner self knows itself as both a brother and a son.
The above notes were taken with great difficulty by Helen and constitute the only series this far that were written very slowly. When Helen asked about this, she was told, "Don't worry about the notes. They are right, but you are not sufficiently right-minded yet to write about the atonement with comfort. You will write about it yet with joy."
Aside from Helen, last night I felt briefly but intensely depressed, temporarily under the impression that I was abandoned. I tried but couldn't get through at all. After a while, I decided to give up for the time being, and he said, "Don't worry, I will never leave you or forsake you." I did feel a little better and decided I was really not sick, so I could return to my exercises. While I was exercising, I had some part vision experiences, which I found only mildly frightening at times and quite reassuring at others.
I'm not too sure of the sentence, but it began with a very clear assurance of love and an equally clear emphasis on my own great value, beauty and purity. Things got a little bit confusing after that. First, the idea of Bride of Christ occurred to me with vaguely inappropriate undertones. Then there was a repetition of the way of love, and a restatement of an earlier experience, now as if it were from him to me. Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it undone unto you according to his word. This threw me into panic before, but at that time it was stated in the more accurate biblical phrasing, be it done unto me according to his word. This time I was a bit uneasy, but I remembered I had misperceived it last time, and was probably still seeing it right. Actually, it is really just a statement of allegiance to the divine service, which can hardly be dangerous.
Then there was a strange sequence in which Christ seemed to be making very obvious advances, which became quite sexual in my perception of them. I almost thought briefly that he turned into a devil. I got just a little scared, and the possession idea came in for a while. But I thought it's so silly that there is no point in taking it seriously.
As I'm writing this, I remembered that thing in the book about the demon lover, which once threw me, note spelling through, into a fit. I'm upset, but the spelling slip is reassuring.
This morning we reviewed the whole episode. He said he was very pleased at the comparative lack of fear and also the concomitant awareness that it was misperception. This showed much greater strength and a much increased right-mindedness. This is because defenses are now being used much better on behalf of truth more than error, though not completely so.
The weaker use of misprojection is shown by my recognition that it can't really be that way, which became possible as soon as denial was applied against error, not truth. This permitted a much greater awareness of alternative interpretations.
It was also explained, the shift to the passive form instead of he also explained should be noted. This is an expression of fear. Remember the section in Letters from the Scattered Brotherhood you read last evening about hold fast and please do so.
Note made on 11:15 by Helen regarding Bill's remark concerning 116, top of page 5. Yes, but I doubt if it says this is inevitable. It may entail more miswill than we think. The above may be seen too passively interpreted. Note that Bill did not ask my will regarding same. If he had, he would have felt much better.
You know that when defenses are disrupted, there is a period of real disorientation, accompanied by fear, guilt, and usually vacillations between anxiety and depression. This process is different only in that defenses are not being disrupted, but reinterpreted, even though it may be experienced as the same thing.
In the reinterpretation of defenses, they are not disturbed, but their use for attack is lost. Since this means that they can be used only one way, they became much stronger and much more dependable. They no longer oppose the atonement, but greatly facilitate it. The atonement can only be accepted within you.
You have perceived it largely as external thus far, and that is why your experience of it has been minimal. You have been shown the chalice many times, but have not accepted it for yourself. Your major improper use of defenses is now largely limited to externalization. Do not fail to appreciate your own remarkable progress in this respect. You perceived it first as a vessel of some sort whose purpose was uncertain, but which might be a piss pot. You did notice, however, that the inside was gold, while the outside, though skinny, though shiny, was silver. This was a recognition of the fact that the inner part is more precious than the outer side, even though both are resplendent, though with different value.
The reinterpretation of defenses is essential to break open the inner light. Since the separation, man's defenses have been used almost entirely to defend themselves against the atonement and thus maintain their separation. They generally see this as a need to protect the body from external intrusion or intruding. And this kind of misperception is largely responsible for the homosexual fallacy, as well as your own pregnancy fears. The so-called anal behavior is a distorted attempt to steal the atonement and deny its worth by concealing it and holding on to it with a bodily receptacle, which is regarded as particularly vicious. Oral fantasies are rather similar in purpose, except that they stem more from a sense of deprivation, an insatiable thirst which results. Anal fallacies are more of a refusal to give, while oral fantasies emphasize the distorted need to take. The main error in both is to believe that the body can be used as a means for attaining atonement.
Perceiving the body as the temple is only the first step in correcting this kind of distortion. Helen scalded hand and looked for butter to put on. It occurred to her that the atonement was the cure. Burn appeared to be minimal and caused little discomfort.
Seeing the body as the temple alters the part of the misperception, but not all of it. It does recognize, however, that the conception of addition or subtraction in physical terms is not appropriate. But the next step is to realize that a temple is not a building at all. Its real holiness lies in the inner altar, around which the building is built. The inappropriate emphasis which men have put on beautiful church buildings is a sign of their own fear of atonement, an unwillingness to reach the altar itself. The real beauty of the temple cannot be seen with the physical eye. The spiritual eye, on the other hand, cannot see the building at all, but it perceives the altar within with perfect clarity. This is because the spiritual eye has perfect vision.
For perfect effectiveness, the chalice of the atonement belongs at the center of the inner altar, where it undoes the separation and restores the wholeness of the spirit. Before the separation, the mind was invulnerable to fear because fear did not exist. Both the separation and the fear were miscreations of the mind, which have to be undone. This is what the Bible means by the restoration of the temple. It does not mean the restoration of the building, but it does mean the opening of the altar to receive the atonement.
This heals the separation and places within man the one defense against all separation mind errors, which can make him perfectly invulnerable.
Acceptance of the atonement by everyone is only a matter of time. In fact, both time and matter were created for this purpose. This appears to contradict free will because of the inevitability of this decision. If you review the idea carefully, you will realize that this is not true. Everything is limited in some way by the manner of its creation. Free will can temporize and is capable of enormous procrastination, but it cannot depart entirely from its creator, who set the limits on its ability to miscreate by virtue of its own real purpose.
The misuse of will engenders a situation which, in the extreme, becomes altogether intolerable. Pain thresholds can be high, but they are not limitless. Eventually, everybody begins to recognize, however dimly, that there must be a better way. As this recognition is more firmly established, it becomes a perceptual turning point. This ultimately reawakens the spiritual eye, simultaneously weakening the investment in physical sight. The alternating investment in the two types of levels of perception is usually experienced as conflict for a long time and can become very acute.
But the outcome is as certain as God. The spiritual eye literally cannot see error and merely looks for atonement. All the solutions which the physical eye seek dissolve in its sight. The spiritual eye, which looks within, recognizes immediately that the altar has been defiled and needs to be repaired and protected. Perfectly aware of the right defense, it passes over all others, looking past error to truth. Because of the real strength of its vision, it pulls the will into its own service and forces the mind to concur. This reestablishes the true power of the will and makes it increasingly unable to tolerate delay. The mind then realizes with increasing certitude that delay is only a way of increasing unnecessary pain, which it need not tolerate at all. The pain threshold drops accordingly, and the mind becomes increasingly sensitive to what it once would have regarded as very minor intrusions of discomfort.
The children of God are entitled to perfect comfort, which comes from a sense of perfect trust. Until they achieve this, they waste themselves and their true creative power on useless attempts to make themselves more comfortable by improper means. But a real means is already provided and does not involve any efforts on their part at all. Their egocentricity usually misperceives this as personally insulting, an interpretation which obviously arises from the misperception of themselves. Egocentricity and communion cannot coexist. Even the terms themselves are contradictory.
The atonement is the only gift which is worthy of being offered to the altar of God. This is because of the inestimable value of the altar itself. It was created perfect and is entirely worthy of receiving perfection. God is lonely without his souls, and they are lonely without him. Remember the spiritual, a very good term, which begins with, and God stepped down from heaven and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. The world was a way of healing the separation, and the atonement is the guarantee that the device will ultimately do so.
Helen requests for a special message for Bill. Tell Bill that his delaying tactics are holding him back. He does not really understand detachment, distanciation, and withdrawal. He is interpreting them as holding himself aloof from the atonement. A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 2, Section C, Healing as Release from Fear. The new emphasis will be on healing now. The miracle is the means, the atonement the principle, and the healing is the result. Those who speak of the miracle of healing are combining two orders of reality inappropriately. Healing is not a miracle. The atonement or the final miracle is a remedy. It is purely a means, while any type of healing is a result.
The order of error to which atonement is applied is irrelevant. Essentially, all healing is the release from fear. But to undertake this, you cannot be fearful yourself.
You do not understand healing because of your own fear. I've been hinting throughout, and once stated very directly, because you were unfearful at the time, that you must heal others. The reason is that their healing merely witnesses or attests to yours.
A major step in the atonement plan is to undo error at all levels. Illness, which is really not right-mindedness, is the result of level confusion in the sense that it always entails the misbelief that what is amiss in one level can adversely affect another.
We have constantly reverted to miracles as the means of correcting level confusion. In reality, all mistakes must be corrected at the level at which they occur. Only the mind is capable of error. The body can act erroneously, but this is only because it has responded to misthought. The body cannot create, and the belief that it can, a fundamental error responsible for most of the fallacies already referred to, produces all physical symptoms.
All physical illness represents a belief in magic. The whole distortion which created magic rested on the belief that there is a creative ability in matter which can control the mind. This fallacy can work either way, i.e., it can be misbelieved either that the mind can miscreate in the body or that the body can miscreate in the mind. If it can be made clear that the mind, which is the only level of creation, cannot create beyond itself, then neither confusion need occur.
The reason why only the mind can create is more obvious than may be immediately apparent. The soul has been created. The body is a learning device for the mind. Learning devices are not lessons in themselves. Their purpose is merely to facilitate the thinking of the learner. The most that a faulty use of a learning device can do is to fail to facilitate. It does not have the power in itself to introduce actual learning errors.
The body, if properly understood, shares the invulnerability of the atonement to two-edged application. This is not because the body is a miracle, but because it is not inherently open to misinterpretation. The body is merely a fact. Its abilities can be, and frequently are, overvaluated. However, it is almost impossible to deny its existence. Those who do are engaging in a particularly unworthy form of denial. The use of the word unworthy here implies simply that it is not necessary to protect the mind by denying the unmindful. There is little doubt that the mind can miscreate. If one denies this unfortunate aspect of its power, one is also denying the power itself.
All material means which man accepts as remedies for bodily ills are simply restatements of magic principles. It was the first level of the error to believe that the body creates its own illness. Thereafter, it is a second misstep to attempt to heal it through non-creative agents. It does not follow, however, that the application of these very weak corrective devices are evil. Sometimes the illness has sufficiently great a hold over an individual's mind to render him inaccessible to atonement. In this case, one be wise to utilize a compromise approach to mind and body in which something from the outside is temporarily given healing belief. This is because the last thing that can help the non-right-minded or the sick is an increase in fear. They are already in a fear-weakened state. If they are inappropriately exposed to a straight and undiluted miracle, they may be precipitated into panic. This is particularly likely to occur when upside-down perception has induced the belief that miracles are frightening.
The value of the atonement does not lie in the manner in which it is expressed. In fact, if it is truly used, it will inevitably be expressed in whatever way is most helpful to the receiver, not the giver. This means that a miracle, to attain its full efficacy, must be expressed in a language which the recipient can understand without fear. It does not follow by any means that this is the highest level of communication of which he is capable, but it does mean that it is the highest level of communication of which he is capable now.
The whole aim of the miracle is to raise the level of communication, not to impose regression as improperly used upon it. Before it is safe to let miracle workers loose in this world, it is essential that they understand fully the fear of release. Otherwise, they may unwittingly foster the misbelief that release is imprisonment, which is very prevalent. This misperception arose from the attempted protection device or misdefense, that harm can be limited to the body. This was because of the much greater fear which this one counteracts, that the mind can hurt itself. Neither error is really meaningful because the miscreations of the mind do not really exist. That recognition is far better protection device than any form of level confusion because of the advantages of introducing correction at the level of the error.
It is essential that the remembrance of the fact that only mind can create at all remain with you. Implicit in this is the corollary that correction belongs to the thought level and not at either level to which creation is inapplicable. To repeat an earlier statement and also to extend it somewhat, the soul is already perfect and therefore does not require correction. The body does not really exist except as a learning device for the mind. This learning device is not subject to errors of its own because it was created, but is not creating. It should be obvious then that correcting the creator or inducing it to give up miscreation is the only application of creation which is inherently meaningful at all.
We said before that magic is essentially mindless or destructive, miscreated use of mind. Physical medicines are a form of spells, in a way that they are a more benign form, in that they do not entail the possession fallacy which does enter when a mind believes that it can possess another. Since this is considerably less dangerous, though still incorrect, it has its advantages. It is particularly helpful to the therapist who really wants to heal, but is still fearful himself. By using physical means to do so, he is not engaging in any form of enslavement, even though he is not applying the atonement. This means that his mind is dulled by fear, but is not actively engaged in distortion.
Those who are afraid of using the mind to heal are right in avoiding it, because the very fact that they are afraid has made them vulnerable to miscreation. They are therefore likely to misunderstand any healing that they might induce, and because egocentricity and fear usually occur together, may be unable to accept the real source of the healing. Under these conditions, it is safer for them to rely temporarily on physical healing devices because they cannot misperceive them as their own creations. As long as their own vulnerability persists, it is essential to preserve them from even attempting miracles.
We said in a previous section that a miracle is an expression of miracle-mindedness. Miracle-mindedness merely means right-mindedness in the sense that we are now using it. Right-mindedness neither exalts nor depreciates. the mind of the miracle worker, nor the miracle receiver. However, as a creative act, the miracle need not await the right-mindedness of the receiver. In fact, its purpose is to restore him to his right mind. But it is essential that the miracle worker be in his right mind, or he will be unable to re-establish right-mindedness in someone else.
The healer who relies on his own readiness is endangering his understanding. He is perfectly safe as long as he is completely unconcerned about his readiness, but maintains a consistent trust in mine. Errors of this kind produce some very erratic behavior, which usually point up an underlying unwillingness to cooperate. Note that by inserting the carbon backwards, Bill created a situation in which two copies did not exist. This reflected two levels of confidence lack, one in my readiness to heal and the other in his own willingness to give. These errors inevitably introduce inefficiency into the miracle worker's behavior and temporarily disrupt his miracle-mindedness. We might also take very similar comments about your own hesitation about dictating at all. This is a larger error only because it results in greater inefficiency. If you don't say anything, nobody can use it, including me. We have established that for all corrective processes, the first step is know that this is fear. Unless fear had entered, the corrective procedure would never have become necessary. If your miracle working propensities are not working, it is always because fear has intruded on your right-mindedness and has literally upset it, i.e., turned it upside down.
All forms of not right-mindedness are the result of the refusal to accept the atonement for yourself. If the miracle worker does accept it, he places himself in the position to recognize that those who need to be healed are simply those who have not done so. The reason why you felt the fast radiation range of your own inner illumination is because you were aware that your right-mindedness is healing. The sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept atonement for himself. This means that he knows that mind is the only creative level, and that its errors are healed by the atonement. Once he accepts this, his mind can only heal. By denying his mind any destructive potential and reinstating its purely constructive powers, he has placed himself in a position where he can undo the level confusion of others. The message which he then gives to others is the truth that their minds are really similarly constructive and that their own miscreations cannot hurt them. By affirming this, the miracle worker releases the mind from over-evaluating its own learning device, the body, and restores the mind to its true position as the learner. It should be re-emphasized that the body does not learn any more than it creates. As a learning device, it merely follows the learner. But if it is falsely endowed with self-initiative, it becomes a serious obstruction to the learning it should facilitate.
Only the mind is capable of illumination. The soul is already illuminated, and the body in itself is too dense. The mind, however, can bring its own illumination to the body by recognizing that density is the opposite of intelligence, and therefore unamenable to independent learning. It is, however, easily brought into alignment with the mind, which has learned to look beyond density toward light.
Corrective learning always begins with awakening the spiritual eye and turning away from belief in physical sight. The reason this entails fear is because man is afraid of what his spiritual eye will see, which was why he closed it in the first place. We said before that the spiritual eye cannot see error, and is capable only of looking beyond it to the defense of atonement. There is no doubt that the spiritual eye does produce extreme discomfort by what it sees. The thing that man forgets is that the discomfort is not the final outcome of its perception. When the spiritual eye is permitted to look upon the defilement of the altar, it also looks immediately toward atonement. Nothing which the spiritual eye perceives can induce fear. Everything that results from accurate spiritual awareness merely is channelized towards correction. Discomfort is aroused only to bring the need to correct forcibly into awareness.
What the physical eye sees is not corrective, nor can it be corrected by any device which can be physically seen. As long as a man believes in what his physical sight tells him, all his corrective behavior will be misdirected. The reason why the real vision is obscured is because man cannot endure to see his own defiled altar. But since the altar has been defiled, this fact becomes doubly dangerous unless it is perceived. This perception is totally non-threatening because of the atonement. The fear of healing arises in the end from an unwillingness to accept the unequivocal fact that healing is necessary. The fear arises because of the necessary willingness to look at the man has done to himself.
Healing was an ability which was lent to men after the separation, before which it was completely unnecessary. Like all aspects of the space-time belief, healing ability is temporary. However, as long as time persists, healing remains among the stronger human protections. This is because healing always rests on charity, and charity is a way of perceiving the true perception, true perfection of another, even if he cannot perceive it himself. Most of the loftier concepts of which man is capable now are time-dependent. Charity is really a weaker reflection of a much more powerful love encompassment, which is far beyond any form of charity that man can conceive of as yet. Charity is essential to right-mindedness, in the limited sense to which right-mindedness now can be attained. Charity is a way of looking at another as if he had already gone far beyond his actual accomplishment in time. Since his own thinking is faulty, he cannot see the atonement himself, or he would have no need for charity at all. The charity which is accorded him is both an acknowledgement that he is weak and a recognition that he could be stronger. The way in which both of these beliefs are stated clearly implies the dependency on time, making it quite apparent that charity lies within the framework of human limitations, though toward the higher levels.
We said before, twice in fact, that only revelation transcends time. The miracle, as an expression of true human charity, can only shorten it at best. It must be understood, however, that whenever a man offers a miracle to another, he is shortening the suffering of both. This introduces a correction into the record, which corrects retroactively as well as progressively.
A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 2, Section D, Fear as Lack of Love. You and Bill both believe that being afraid is involuntary, but I've told you many times that only constructive acts should be involuntary. We said that Christ's control can take over everything that doesn't matter, and Christ's guidance can direct everything that does, if you so will.
Fear cannot be Christ-controlled, but it can be self-controlled. Fear is always associated with what does not matter. It prevents me from controlling it. The correction is therefore a matter of your will, because its presence shows that you have raised the unimportant to a higher level than it warrants. You have thus brought it under your will where it does not belong, which means you feel responsible for it. The level confusion here is perfectly obvious.
The reason that I cannot control fear for you is that you are attempting to raise to the mind level the proper content of the lower order reality. I do not foster level confusion, but you can will to correct it.
You would not tolerate insane behavior on your part and would hardly advance the excuse that you could not help it. Why should you tolerate insane thinking? This is a fallacy here. You would do well to look at clearly.
You both believe that you are responsible for what you do, but not for what you think. The truth is that you are responsible for what you think, because it is only at this level that you can exercise choice. What you do comes from what you think. You cannot separate the truth by giving autonomy to your behavior. This is controlled by me automatically as soon as you place what you think under my guidance.
Whenever you are afraid, it is a sure sign that you have allowed your mind to miscreate, i.e., have not allowed me to guide it. It is pointless to believe that controlling the outcome of misthought can result in real healing. When you are fearful, you have willed wrongly. This is why you feel you're responsible for it.
You must change your mind, not your behavior, and this is a matter of will. You do not need guidance except at the mind level. Correction belongs only at the level where creation is possible. The term does not really mean anything at the symptom level where it cannot work.
The correction of fear is your responsibility. When you ask for release from fear, you're implying that it isn't. You should ask instead for help in the conditions which have brought the fear about. This condition always entails a separated mind willingness. At this level, you can help it.
You are much too tolerant of mind wandering, thus passively condoning its miscreation. The particular result never matters, but this fundamental error does. The fundamental correction is always the same. Before you will to do anything, ask me if your will is in accord with mine. If you are sure that it is, there will be no fear.
Fear is always a sign of strain, which arises whenever the will to do conflicts with what you do. This situation arises in two major ways. One, you can will to do conflicting things, either simultaneously or successively. This produces conflicting behavior, which would be tolerable to the self, though not necessarily to others, except for the fact that the part of the will that wants something else is outraged. Two, you can behave as you think you should, but without entirely willing to do so. This produces consistent behavior, but entails great strain within the self.
If you think about it, you will realize that in both cases the will and the behavior are out of accord, resulting in a situation in which you are doing what you do not will. This arouses a sense of coercion, which usually produces rage. The anger then invades the mind, and projection in the wrong sense becomes likely. Depression or anxiety are virtually certain.
Remember that whenever there is fear, it is because you have not made up your mind. Your will is split and your behavior inevitably becomes erratic. Correcting at the behavior level can shift the error from the first type to the second, but will not obliterate it from fear.
It is possible to reach a state in which you bring your will under my guidance without much conscious effort, but this implies the kind of habit pattern which neither you nor Bill has developed dependably as yet.
Tell Bill that although he keeps telling you that God will never ask you to do more than you can, he does not understand it himself. God cannot ask more than you will. The strength to do comes from your own individual will to do. There is no strain in doing God's will as soon as it is also your own.
The lesson here is quite simple, but particularly apt to be overlooked. I will therefore repeat it, urging you to listen. Only your mind can produce fear. It does so when it is conflicted in what it wills, thus producing inevitable strain, because willing and doing become discordant. This cannot be corrected by better doing, but it can be corrected by higher willing. A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 2, Section E, the correction for lack of love. After taking the first corrective step, that is, knowing it is fear, you might benefit temporarily by adding another next step before going on with the corrective process. Try saying to yourself that you must have willed not to love somehow or somewhere, or that fear which arises from behavior will conflict, could not have happened. Then follow previous instructions.
If you consider what the process really means, it is nothing more than a series of pragmatic steps in the larger process of accepting the atonement as the remedy. From this viewpoint, the steps can be reworded as follows. 1. Know first this is fear. 2. Fear arises from lack of love. 3. The only remedy for lack of love is perfect love. 4. Perfect love is the atonement.
The final procedural step is inherent in the last statement. We have emphasized that the miracle, or the expression of atonement, is always a sign of real respect from the worthy to the worthy. This worth is re-established by the atonement.
It is obvious then that when you are afraid you have placed yourself in a position where you need atonement because you have done something loveless, because you willed without love. This is precisely the situation for which the atonement was offered. The need for the remedy inspired its creation.
As long as you recognize only the need for the remedy, you will remain fearful. However, as soon as you remedy it, you have also abolished the fear. This is how true healing occurs.
Everyone experiences fear and nobody enjoys it. Yet it would take very little right thinking to know why it occurs. Neither you nor Bill have thought about it very much either. I object at this point to the use of plural verb with a properly singular subject, Helen. And remember that last time in a very similar sentence, he said it correctly and I remembered it with real pleasure. The real grammatical error makes me suspicious of the genuineness of the notes. Answer. What it really shows is that you are not very receptive. The reason it came out that way is because you are projecting in the inappropriate way, your own anger, which has nothing to do with these notes. You made the error because you are not feeling loving. So you want me to sound silly, so you won't have to pay attention. Actually, I am trying to get through against considerable opposition because you are not very happy, and I wish you were. I thought I'd take a chance, even though you are so resistant, because I might be able to make you feel better. You may be unable not to attack at all, but do try to listen a little too.
Very few people appreciate the real power of the mind. Nobody remains fully aware of it all the time. This is inevitable in this world because the human being has many things he must do and cannot engage in constant thought watching. However, if he hopes to spare himself from fear, there are some things he must realize, and realize them fully, at least some of the time.
The mind is a very powerful creator, and it never loses its creative force. It never sleeps. Every instant it is creating, and always as you will. Many of your ordinary expressions reflect this. For example, when you say, don't give it a thought, you're implying that if you do not think about something, it will have no effect on you. This is true enough.
On the other hand, many other expressions are clear expressions of the prevailing lack of awareness of thought power. For example, you say just an idle thought, and mean that the thought has no effect. You also speak of some actions as thoughtless, implying that if the person had thought, he would not have behaved as he did. You also use phrases like thought-provoking, which is bland enough, but the term a provoking thought means something quite different.
While expressions like think big give some recognition to the power of thought, they still come nowhere near the truth. You do not expect to grow when you say it because you don't really believe it. It is hard to recognize that thought and belief combine into a power surge that can literally move mountains.
It appears at first glance that to believe such power about yourself is merely arrogant, but that's not the real reason why you don't believe it.
People prefer to believe that their thoughts cannot exert real control because they are literally afraid of them. Therapists try to help people who are afraid of their own death wishes by depreciating the power of the wish. They even attempt to free the patient by persuading him that he can think whatever he wants without any real effect at all.
There's a real dilemma here, which only the true right-minded can escape. Death wishes do not kill in the physical sense, but they do kill spiritually. All destructive thinking is dangerous. Given a death wish, a man has no choice except to act upon his thought, or behave contrary to it. He can thus choose only between homicide and fear. See notes on will conflicts. Note, I avoided this term in the last series of notes intentionally because I seemed too Rankian. Apparently, there was no reason why this word should have been used last time. It is used in this section for a very good reason.
The other possibility is that he depreciates the power of his thought. This is the usual psychoanalytic approach. This does allay guilt, but at the cost of rendering thinking impotent. If you believe that what you think is ineffectual, you may cease to be overly afraid of it, but you are hardly likely to respect it either. The word is full of endless examples of how man has depreciated himself because he is afraid of his own thoughts. In some forms of insanity, thoughts are glorified, But this is only because the underlying depreciation was too effective for tolerance.
The truth is that there are no idle thoughts. All thinking produces form at some level. The reason why people are afraid of ESP and so often react against it is because they know that thought can hurt them. Their own thoughts have made them vulnerable.
You and Bill, who complain all the time about fear, still persist in creating it most of the time. I told you last time that you cannot ask me to release you from it because I know it does not exist. You don't. If I merely intervene between your thoughts and their results, I would be tampering with a basic law of cause and effect. In fact, the most fundamental one there is in the world. I would hardly help if I depreciated the power of your own thinking. This would be in direct opposition to the purpose of this course.
It is certainly much more useful to remind you that you do not guard your thoughts at all carefully, except for the relative small part of the day, and somewhat inconsistently even then. You may feel at this point that it would take a miracle to enable you to do this, which is perfectly true. Human beings are not used to miraculous thinking, but they can be trained to think that way.
All miracle workers have to be trained that way. I have to be able to count on them. This means that I cannot allow them to leave their mind unguarded, or they will not be able to help me. Miracle working entails a full realization of the power of thought and real avoidance of miscreation. Otherwise, the miracle will be necessary to set the mind itself straight, a circular process which would hardly foster the time collapse for which the miracle was intended. Nor would it induce the healthy respect that every miracle worker must have for true cause and effect.
Miracles cannot free the miracle worker from fear. Both miracles and fear come from his thoughts, and if he were not free to choose one, he would not be free to choose the other. Remember, we said before that when electing one person, you reject another.
It is much the same in electing the miracle. By so doing, you have rejected fear. Fear cannot assail unless it has been created. You and Bill have been afraid of God, of me, of yourselves, and of particularly everyone you know at one time or another. This can only be because you have miscreated all of us and believe what you have created. We spent a lot of time on this before, but it did not help very much. You would never have done this if you were not afraid of your own thoughts. The vulnerable are essentially miscreators because they misperceive creation.
You and Bill are willing to accept primarily what does not change your minds too much and leaves you free to leave them quite unguarded most of the time. You persist in believing that when you do not consciously watch your mind, it is unmindful.
It is time to consider the whole world of the unconscious or unwatched mind. This will frighten you because it is the source of fright. You may look at it as a new theory of basic conflict, if you wish, which will not be entirely an intellectual approach, because I doubt if the truth will escape you entirely.
The unwatched mind is responsible for the whole content of the unconscious, which lies above the miracle level. All psychoanalytic theorists have made some contribution to the truth in this connection, but none of them has seen it in its true entirety. The correct grammar here is a sign of your better cooperation. Thank you. Jung's best contribution was an awareness of individual versus collective unconscious levels. He also recognized the major place of the religious spirit in his schema. His archetypes were also meaningful concepts, but his major error lay in regarding the deepest level of the unconscious as shared in terms of content. The deepest level of the unconscious is shared as an ability. As miracle-mindedness, the content, or the particular miracles which an individual happens to perform, does not matter at all. They will in fact be entirely different, because since I direct them, I make a point of avoiding redundancy. Unless a miracle actually heals, it is not a miracle at all.
The content of the miracle level is not recorded in the individual's unconscious, because if it were, it would not be automatic and involuntary, which we have said repeatedly it should be. However, the content is a matter for the record, which is not within the individual himself.
All psychoanalysts made one common error in that they attempt to uncover unconscious content. You cannot understand unconscious activity in these terms because content is applicable only to the more superficial unconscious levels to which the individual himself contributes. This is the level at which he can readily introduce fear, and usually does.
Freud was right in calling this level preconscious and emphasizing that there is a fairly easy interchange between preconscious and conscious material. He was also right in regarding the censor as an agent for the protection of consciousness from fear. His major error lay in his insistence that this level is necessary at all in the psychic structure. If the psyche contains fearful levels from which it cannot escape without splitting, its integration is permanently threatened. It is essential not to control the fearful, but to eliminate it.
Here, Ranke's concept of the will was particularly good, except that he referred to ally it only with man's own truly creative ability, but did not extend it to its proper union with God's. His birth trauma, another valid idea, was also too limited, in that it did not refer to the separation, which was really a false idea of birth. Physical birth is not a trauma in itself. It can, however, remind the individual of the separation, which was a very real cause of fear.
The idea of will therapy was potentially a very powerful one, but Rank did not see its real potential because he himself used his mind partly to create a theory of the mind, but also partly to attack Freud. His reactions to Freud stemmed from his own unfortunate acceptance of the deprivation fallacy, which itself arose from the separation. This led him to believe that his own mind creation could stand only if the creation of another's fell. In consequence, his theory emphasized rather than minimized the two-edged nature of defenses. This is an outstanding characteristic of his concepts because it was outstandingly true of him.
He also misinterpreted the birth trauma in a way that made it inevitable for him to attempt a therapy whose goal was to abolish fear. This is characteristic of all later theorists who do not attempt, as Freud did, to split off the fear in his own form of therapy.
No one as yet has fully recognized either the therapeutic value of fear or the only way in which it can truly be ended. When man miscreates, he is in pain. The cause and effect principle here is temporarily a real expeditor. Actually, cause is a term properly belonging to God, and effect which should also be capitalized, is his sonship. This entails a set of cause and effect relationships which are today different from those which man introduced into the miscreation.
The fundamental opponents in the real basic conflict are creation and miscreation. All fear is implicit in the second, just as all love is inherent in the first. Because of this difference, the basic conflict is one between love and fear.
So much then for the true nature of the major opponents in the basic conflict. Since all such theories lead to a form of therapy in which a redistribution of psychic energy results, it is necessary to consider our concept of libido next. In this respect, Freud was more accurate than his followers, who were essentially more wishful. Energy can emanate from both creation and miscreation, and the particular ratio between them which prevails at a given point in time does determine behavior at that time. If miscreation did not engender energy in its own right, it would be unable to produce destructive behavior, which it very patently does.
Everything that man creates has energy because, like the creation of God, it come from energy and are endowed by their creator with the power to create. Miscreation is still a genuine creative act in terms of the underlying impulse, but not in terms of the content of the creation. This, however, does not deprive the creation of its own creative power. It does, however, guarantee that the power will be misused or used fearfully.
To deny this is merely the previously mentioned fallacy of depreciation. Although Freud made a number of fallacies of his own, he did avoid this one in connection with libido. The later theorists denied the split energy concept, not by attempting to heal it, but by reinterpreting it instead of redistributing it.
This placed them in the illogical position of assuming that the split, which their therapies were intended to heal, had not occurred. The result of this approach is essentially a form of hypnosis. This is quite different from Freud's approach, which merely ended in a deadlock.
A similar deadlock occurs when both the power of creation and of miscreation coexist. This is experienced as conflict only because the individual feels as if both were occurring at the same level. He believes in what he has created in his own unconscious, and he naturally believes it is real because he has created it. He thus places himself in a position where the fearful becomes real.
Nothing but level confusion can result as long as disbelief is held in any form. Inappropriate denial and equally inappropriate identification of the real factors in the basic conflict will not solve the problem itself. The conflict cannot disappear until it is fully recognized that miscreation is not real, and therefore there is no conflict. This entails a full realization of the basic fact that, although man has miscreated a very real sense, he need neither continue to do so nor to suffer from his past errors in this respect.
A redistribution of psychic energy, then, is not the solution. Both the idea that both kinds must exist and the belief that one kind is amenable for use or misuse are real distortions. The only way is to stop miscreating now and accept the atonement for miscreations of the past. Only this can re-establish true single-mindedness. The structure of the psyche, as you very correctly noted yourself, follows along the lines of the particular libido concept the theorist employs. I still think it was the other way around. Helen, answer. This confusion arises out of the fact that you did change the order several times, in fact. Actually, it didn't matter because the two concepts do flow from each other. It was a terrific waste of time and one in which I hardly care to become again engaged myself, please.
Freud's psyche was essentially a good and evil picture, with very heavy weight given to the evil. This is because every time I mentioned the atonement to him, which was quite often, he responded by defending his theory more and more against it. This resulted in his increasingly long attempts to make the illogical sound more and more logical.
I was very sorry about this because his was a singularly good mind and it was a shame to waste it. However, the major purpose of his incarnation was not neglected. He did succeed in forcing recognition of the unconscious into man's calculations about himself, a step in the right direction which should not be minimized. Freud was one of the most religious men I have known recently. Unfortunately, he was so afraid of religion that the only way he could deal with it was to regard it, not himself, as sick. This naturally prevented healing.
Freud's superego is a particularly interesting example of the real power of miscreation. It is noteworthy throughout the whole development of his theories that the superego never allied itself with freedom. The most it could do in this direction was to work out a painful truce in which both opponents lost. This perception could not fail to force him to emphasize discontent in his view of civilization.
The Freudian id is really only the more superficial level of the unconscious and not the deepest level at all. This too was inevitable because Freud could not divorce miracles from magic. It was therefore his constant endeavor, even preoccupation, to keep on thrusting more and more material between consciousness and the real deeper level of the unconscious, so that the latter became increasingly obscured. The result was a kind of bedlam in which there was no order, no control, and no sense. This was exactly how he felt about it.
The later theoretical switch to the primacy of anxiety was an interesting device intended to deny both the instinctive nature of destructiveness and the force of the power of miscreation. By placing the emphasis on the result, the generative nature of the power was minimized.
Destructive behavior is instinctual. The instinct for creation is not obliterated in miscreation. That is why it is always invested with reality. One of the chief ways in which man can correct his magic miracle confusion is to remember that he did not create himself. He is apt to forget this when he becomes egocentric, and this places him in a position where belief in magic is virtually inevitable. His instincts for creation were given him by his own creator, who was expressing the same instinct in his creation. Since the creative ability rests solely in the mind, everything which man creates is necessarily instinctive.
This goes after basic conflict theory, dictated without notes by Helen.
We have already said that the basic conflict is one between love and fear, and that the proper organization of the psyche rests on a lack of level confusion. The section on psychic energy should be reread very carefully because it is particularly likely to be misinterpreted until this section is complete.
It has already been said that man cannot control fear because he himself created it. His belief in it renders it out of his control by definition. For this reason, any attempt to resolve the basic conflict through the concept of mastery of fear is meaningless. In fact, it asserts the power of fear by the simple assumption that it need be mastered at all.
The essential resolution rests entirely on the mastery of love. In the interim, conflict is inevitable. The reason for this is the strangely illogical position in which man had placed himself. Since we have frequently emphasized that correction must be applied within the level that error occurs, it should be clear that the miracle must be illogical because its purpose is to correct the illogical and restore order.
Two concepts which cannot coexist are nothing and everything. To whatever extent one is believed in, the other has been abolished. In the conflict, fear is really nothing and love is really everything. This recognition is really the basis for the castration complex. This is because whenever light penetrates darkness, it does abolish it. The unwillingness to be seen or submit error to light is spuriously associated with active doing. In this incarnation, this can take the form of the Oedipal involvement and concomitant castration anxiety.
However, in more long-range and meaningful terms, the Oedipal complex is a miniature of the true separation fear, and the castration complex is a way of denying that it ever occurred. Like all pseudo-solutions, this kind of distorted thinking is very creative, but false. The separation has occurred. To deny this is merely to misuse denial. However, to concentrate on error is merely a further misuse of legitimate psychic mechanisms. The true corrective procedure, which is already being described as the proper use of the spiritual eye or true vision, is to accept the error temporarily, but only as an indication that immediate correction is mandatory. This establishes a state of mind in which the atonement can be accepted without delay.
It is worth repeating that ultimately there is no compromise possible between everything and nothing. The purpose of time is essentially a device by which all compromise in this respect can be abolished. It seems to be abolished by degrees precisely because time itself involves a concept of intervals which do not really exist. The faulty use of creation has made the necessary as a corrective device.
And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believeth on him shall not perish but have eternal life. Needs only one slight correction to be entirely meaningful in this context. It should read, and God so loved the world that he gave it to his only begotten Son. It should be noted that God has begotten only one Son. If you believe that all of the souls that God created are his sons, and if you also believe that the sonship is one, then every soul must be a son of God, or an integral part of the sonship. You do not find the concept that the whole is greater than its parts difficult to understand. You should therefore not have too great difficulty with this. The sonship in its oneness does transcend the sum of its parts. However, it loses this special state as long as any of its parts are missing. This is why the conflict cannot ultimately be resolved until all of the individual parts of the sonship have returned. Only then, in the true sense, can the meaning of wholeness be understood.
The concept of minus numbers has always been regarded as a mathematical rather than an actual expedient. This is a major limitation on mathematics as presently understood. Any statement which implies degrees of difference in negation is essentially meaningless. What can replace this negative approach is a recognition of the fact that as long as one part, which is the same as 1,000,000 or 10 or 8,000 parts of the sonships is missing, is not complete.
In the divine psyche, the Father and the Holy Spirit are not incomplete at all. The sonship has the unique faculty of believing in error or incompleteness if he so elects. However, it is quite apparent that so to elect is to believe in the existence of nothingness. The correction of this error is the atonement.
We have already briefly spoken about readiness, but there are some additional awarenesses that might be helpful. Readiness is nothing more than the prerequisite for accomplishment. The two should not be confused. As soon as a state of readiness occurs, there is always some will to accomplish, but this is by no means undivided. The state does not imply more than the potential for a shift of will. Confidence cannot develop fully until mastery has been accomplished. We began this section with an attempt to correct the fundamental human error that fear can be mastered. The correction was that only love can be mastered. When I told you that you were ready for revelation, I did not mean that you had in any way mastered this form of communication. However, you yourself attested to your readiness by insisting that I would not have said so if it had not been true. This is an affirmation of readiness. Mastery of love necessarily involves a much more complete confidence in the ability than either of you has attained. But a readiness, at least, is an indication that you believe this is possible. This is only the beginning of confidence.
In case this be misunderstood as a statement that an enormous amount of time will be necessary between readiness and mastery, I would again remind you that time and space are under my control. Dictated without notes by Helen.
One of the chief ways in which man can correct his magic miracle confusion is to remember that he did not create himself. He is apt to forget this when he becomes egocentric, and this places him in a position where belief in magic is virtually inevitable. His instincts for creations were given him by his own creator, who was expressing the same instinct in his creation. Since the creative ability rests solely in the mind, everything which man creates is necessarily instinctive.
It also follows that whatever he creates is real in his own eyes, but not necessarily in the sight of God. This basic distinction leads us directly into the real meaning of the Last Judgment. I am aware of the fact that you would much rather continue with the parallels involved in other theories of basic conflict. However, this would merely be a delay which we will engage in only if you regard it as essential.
A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition. Chapter 2. Section F. The meaning of the Last Judgment. Notes not present in the notes. The final judgment is one of the greatest threat concepts in man's perception. This is only because he does not understand it. Judgment is not an essential attribute of God. Man brought judgment into being only because of the separation. God himself is still the God of mercy. After the separation, however, there was a place for justice in the schema, because it was one of the many learning devices which had to be built into the overall plan. Just as the separation occurred over many millions of years, the Last Judgment will extend over the similarly long period, and perhaps even longer. Its length depends, however, on the effectiveness of the present speed-up. We have frequently noted that the miracle is a device for shortening but not abolishing time. It is a sufficient number of people becoming truly miracle-minded quickly. The shortening process can be almost immeasurable. But it is essential that these individuals free themselves from fear sooner than would ordinarily be the case, because they must emerge from basic conflict if they are to bring peace to the minds of others.
The Last Judgment is generally thought of as a procedure undertaken by God. Actually, it will be undertaken solely by man with my help. It is a final healing rather than a meting out of punishment. However, much man may think punishment is deserved. Punishment as a concept is in total opposition to right-mindedness. The aim of the final judgment is to restore right-mindedness to man.
The final judgment might be called a process of right evaluation. It simply means that finally all men must come to understand what is worthy and what is not. After this, their ability to choose can be reasonably directed. Unless this distinction has been made, the vacillations between free and imprisoned will cannot but continue. The first step toward freedom, then, must entail a sorting out of the false from the true. This is a process of division only in the constructive sense, and reflects the true meaning of the apocalypse. Man will ultimately look upon his own creations and will to preserve only what is good, just as God himself once looked upon what he had created and knew it was good. At this point, the will begin to look with love on its creations, because of their great worthiness. The mind will inevitably disown its miscreations, and having withdrawn the belief from them, they will no longer exist.
The term Last Judgment is frightening, not only because it has been falsely projected onto God, but also because of the association of last with death. This is an outstanding example of upside-down perception. Actually, if it is examined objectively, it is quite apparent that it is really the doorway to life. No man who lives in fear is really alive.
His own final judgment cannot be directed toward himself because he is not his own creation. He can apply it meaningfully and at any time to everything he has ever created, and retain in his real memory only what is good. This is what his own right-mindedness cannot but dictate. The purpose of time is solely to give him time to achieve this judgment. It is his own perfect judgment of his own creation. When everything that he retains is lovable, there is no reason for any fear to remain in him. This is his part in the atonement. This concludes Chapter 2 of the Urtext Manuscripts of A Course in Miracles.